Really excited for you to be joining me. Today I've got an exciting guest, our first guest of this week that I can't wait to introduce you to. He's got some great insights, great ideas to share with you about things that really matter. Your career, your life, your future job, maybe changing your current job. Maybe you're thinking about which career to take up. Whichever situation you're in, we've got some great insights for you today. The first thing I want you to do in the comments section is tell me about where you're at with your career. Do you love what you're doing? Are you trying to change what you're doing? What is your current status, your relationship status with your career? Send in the comment section, I'll read them out. But what I'd like you to do now is I'd like to introduce you to our very special guest. His name's Nick Lovegrove, and I'm going to tell you a bit about him. Now, he spent most of his life at a phenomenal firm, very well-known firm called McKinsey as a senior partner, and he's also been a fellow at Harvard University as well. And he's released this fantastic new book, which is called The Mosaic Principle. Now, the Mosaic Principle, which we're going to find out about, what does that mean? Maybe you're thinking, oh, I can connect to that already. Maybe you knew about mosaics from before. Maybe you've never heard of them before. But this book is all about the 6 dimensions of a remarkable life and career. I'd like you to introduce you to Nick. Nick, thank you so much for being on the show today.
Thanks very much, Jay. It's great to be here.
It's great to have you here. And like I said, when I saw your book on my desk and we knew you were coming on the show, my mind automatically had questions about these 6 dimensions. And the first thing I really wanted to ask you about is, can you just explain the Mosaic Principle in brief, just in 140 characters, a tweet? I'll give you more than that. But just for our audience, just to encapsulate what that message is all about.
Yeah, well, it's great to be here. The Mosaic Principle is that we can live our life to the fullest as a mosaic, which is a rich and diverse set of experiences that enhance us as individuals, and I believe actually strengthen us as a society. That's the Mosaic Principle. Okay,
fantastic. Very nice and simple. Seems that everything can connect with. And I know that these 6 dimensions that you talk about, now on those 6 dimensions, we have moral compass, we have transferable skills, contextual intelligence, a prepared mind, an intellectual thread, and an extended network. Do you think that it's possible for anyone to master all those 6? Or what is your hope for your readers?
Well, no, I'm sure it's not possible to master all of those 6. And nor do I think it's necessary. I think mastery is something we can all aspire to but never quite achieve. But I think they are part of the journey that we go on. And this book really is all about life as a journey with chapters, well, life as a book, if you like, with chapters. And at each stage, in each chapter, you can take on different kinds of challenges and accentuate different kinds of, different of these dimensions. And you'll be tested at different times. For instance, I think moral compass is the kind of thing where you go, well, I think I know roughly what my moral compass is. I know what's right, I know what's wrong. And then you meet a particular challenge that you hadn't expected that comes at you from a different angle than you expected, and you're tested, and you find out how robust your moral compass really is.
Absolutely. I think we all go through those situations where our integrity is tested or our priorities are tested.
I say in the book, there are people I worked with who I thought of as fine people, distinguished people, who ended up committing crimes and are or were in jail as a consequence. And I would never have predicted that. And I don't want to be too dark about it, but something happened in their life that persuaded them that they should do something bad, and I wouldn't have expected that. So I think this is very real for me.
Absolutely. And what in your journey sparked you writing this book? Because when we look at your journey, you're very successful in the corporate world. You've also worked and been involved in academia and government. So obviously you've had an extremely successful career. What sparked you to write this book? I know we were speaking a bit earlier about future generations.
Yeah. So you're kind about my career. I've certainly had a long career, 35 years, advising clients in business and government and the non-profit sector, in culture and the arts and so on. And I think actually it was that very experience of working in different sectors that made me think there's a challenge here. Because what I found was, when I was working in business, I rarely found people who'd worked in other arenas. When I worked in government, I rarely found, and I thought that was a shame and a problem. And then occasionally I'd come across people who had broader experience, who had tried different things, who had worked in different walks of life, and they just added something. I just thought they were very interesting and so I set out to interview as many of those people as I could, more than 200 in the research for the book. And that's really how I came to identifying the 6 dimensions, because they seem to be the common features of these very successful, but I thought very fulfilled people.
Amazing, and I like how you make that clarification between success and fulfillment as well, and your book's really focused on that. So Alex says, hi Jay, I'm actually a 45-year-old trying to make a career change. I'm not totally starting over, but it is a shift that requires more skills while utilizing my years of experience. What advice do you have?
Well, first of all, I think the fact that you're thinking about this is really important, and it may not immediately be obvious what's the next thing to do, but I think the place to look is for something that you have found yourself doing almost in your spare time. You and I talked about this earlier. You know, a big part of these changes in life are when your hobby or your pastime becomes your job. This happened to you, it's happened to me, and where you can say, well, I was doing this thing on the side, but now I really want to make it the focus of my career. That's when you know you'll have achieved your goal and you'll have a more fulfilled life.
And how do you think people start by even figuring that out? I feel a lot of people ask this question, how do I know what my passions are?
Yeah.
How do I know what matters to me?
You know, one of the things that's occurred to me recently is most of us, when we were in college, we thought nothing of the fact that we participated in lots of different things. We were in clubs and societies, we played sports, we acted, we participated in social purpose activities, we did all sorts of things. And then when we get a job, we think, oh no, now I've got to really focus on this, especially if it's the kind of really intense 24/7 kind of job that lots of people have these days. And I think that's a shame, and I think it would be great if more of us could revert to the way we were in college, which is sort of have this broad-minded approach to life. I'm going to try different things. Sure, I'll do my job, but I'll also be involved in clubs and societies or other activities. They're harder to find. College concentrates them in one place, so you have to look harder when you're in the workplace, if you like. But I think that's a really good approach. Yeah.
And what do you mean specifically by a broad-minded approach? Because my thoughts about this was that would you have your Michael Jordans of the world? Would you have people like that who've excelled? Would you have your Beyoncés of the world? Would you have the people who've excelled so closely? Or would you say they are broad-minded too? We're just not looking deeply enough. So yeah.
I absolutely would. I would say they are very broad-minded. People say, you know, what about Mark Zuckerberg or Steve Jobs or the people who built these great businesses? Weren't they intensely focused, incredibly... And I'd say yes, but look at them. Look at the way in which they built their lives. They had multiple interests. Steve Jobs famously talks about the fact that that his interest in calligraphy, which he'd learned while he was actually dropping out of college,
yes.
Became crucial to the development of Apple computers and ultimately of all computers. And that's why calligraphy is so important to modern day computing. To take somebody like Michael Jordan, I mean, somebody obviously who was incredibly good at one sport, but then tried another sport, baseball,
yes.
Not quite as successfully, and then became an owner and has built an enterprise and a franchise around. I think he exemplifies the Mosaic Principle, as do so many successful people.
I think those are both great examples. I think these are things we often miss because you almost look at things on a very surface level. You think, okay, what's that person's job or what are they known for? Right. But then we forget that, yeah, they've kind of expanded or extended themselves into all these other areas.
And it goes to this point about living life in chapters, and the person we were just speaking about, you know, is looking to the next chapter. I have worked for the same firm for a long time, but I lived in different chapters, and I moved country, like you. I moved from the UK to the US. Then I left, I took on a portfolio activities, and I found another job. And then I started working on this book, and that, to my mind, is sort of illustrative of the chapter approach to life.
Awesome. Now let's dive into some of these 6 dimensions a bit more. And let's start with the moral compass. Define the moral compass, and how do we become aware of what a moral compass is or what it should be?
Yeah, I think in a narrow sense, the moral compass is a sort of ethical framework of what you believe is right and wrong, and how you'll know whether you're making the right decisions. But I think more broadly, it's also about how you navigate sort of life's journey, if you like. I call it in the book the motivation map. A compass is most useful when you've got a map. It's not really much use to have a compass if you've got no kind of map. And what the map does is it creates a framework for thinking about the different kinds of motivation that you have in your life. And those motivations change over time. For instance, making money, learning, having impact, being in a leadership position, working amongst colleagues that you really like, and so on. I actually, in the book, talk about 8 of these motivations. And I say, if you have a strong moral compass, you'll be able to figure out how to balance and trade off these different motivations over the course of a life. They won't change, they won't stay the same your whole life. They'll change over time. When I was young, I didn't care very much about making money. Then for a while I did care quite a bit. Now I care slightly less because I'm more interested in the things that I'm really trying to do. So I think these things do change over time.
Okay, interesting. And how can people kind of choose their moral compass in those chapters? I think talking about life in chapters is a brilliant analogy, and it makes lots of sense. But how do we find that people sometimes find a conflict between what they love and what pays well?
Well, I think the first thing is from time to time to step back and go through a sort of self-assessment process. And I have tried to develop a little tool that's in the book and then on my own website that sort of allows people to ask themselves some reasonably structured questions about what really matters to them and what's changing about what really matters to them. Because I think, it is to some degree about self-awareness. I think many of us, if we're honest, go through our careers one year after the next, just carrying on, and don't take time to step back and say, well, what's going on here? Do I want to make a change? Do I want to make an adjustment? So I think self-assessment is crucial to this.
Can you give us some example of some of those questions, and also let the audience know where can we find those if people want to take part in that?
Well, they're in the book, and they're also on my website, nicklovegrove.net. And the kind of questions are, for instance, do you like to read widely about subjects that you don't know much about? Or do you like to have friends from different walks of life? Are you comfortable operating in an arena where you're not the expert, where you don't know very much? Do you mind appearing relatively ignorant, which is, I think, goes with broadening your perspective? Those are the kinds of questions that I think are important to ask.
Absolutely brilliant. Guys, I hope you're going to take part in doing those self-assessments. I thoroughly recommend them. It's a brilliant way of just understanding more about yourself, raising your self-awareness, and starting to think about these things in a structured way, which is sometimes what we don't have. Yeah. We often may have these questions, but you get lost in your own thought process.
Well, I think we have an instinctive feeling of, am I happy or am I not? Do I want to carry on with this or do I want to change? Oftentimes, and I've been involved in this for most of my career, people don't know until they get an alternative offer. Mm-hmm. So they'll come to me and they'll say, well, I'm reasonably happy with what I'm doing, but I've got an offer from somebody else. I think I might take it. And they say, well, I wasn't looking. And I say, well, but why do you want to move? And oftentimes the answer is not very convincing. It's really, well, it's just different. And I always say to them, well, just assume you didn't have this offer. Assume that you were just carrying on. Step back and say, would you want to leave? And if you wanted to leave, what would you want to do? And I think that's a better way of approaching it than the purely reactive, I've got this offer, I think I'll take it.
Absolutely true. Okay, this is a good question right here. I'm about to decide what I want to do after having graduated. Yeah. And I'm looking at these different options, but I really feel that I still don't know what I want to do. Mm-hmm. How do I start, or where should I start when I'm not actually sure?
So it's a great question, and I approach it from 3 perspectives: as an employer of young people graduating, as a parent of kids. So my oldest is 22 and my youngest is 17, and I have 2 in between. And obviously as somebody who's written this book and has thought about this quite a bit. And my simple answer to the question is, just find something that you want to do for the next couple of years. Nice. That helps you to build a foundation of skills. And in a sense, don't worry too much about what happens after that. Mm-hmm. Because you really can't know. The first 2 years will help you so much to learn about the work environment, to learn what you like and what you don't like. And if you choose the right environment, you'll also learn some skills that will then become relevant to, I think, if you have an indication in your mind of what you might want to do longer term, then sure, choose something that's on that path. But don't obsess too much about that path, because that is the thing that could tie you down.
Absolutely. And we were talking a bit about generational differences before. Do you think, of course, we look at previous generations were able to stay in a job for 30, 40 years. Yeah. And whether the person was satisfied or not, there was a high level of tolerance and focus and duty, or whatever it was that kept them motivated. Do you feel that that's kind of still trickling down, where people are looking for that long job, even though we see that young millennials are actually changing jobs more often?
Yeah.
So is our fixation with wanting a long-term career actually what's causing our downfall?
Well, I think it is a part of the problem. It's interesting, when I joined the firm that I joined, McKinsey, I joined expecting to stay there 2 years. That was my goal. I ended up staying 30. But actually, I viewed it each 2 years as a kind of renewal, and I would say, well, I want to go to the next 2 years. I think things have changed now, and I think it is much less common, and it's going to be even less common for people to have the kind of career I've had. There are exceptions to that. You know, obviously, if you are training as a doctor, and this I think is a real tension. If you're training as a doctor, you're probably training in a specialty. And because medicine is like so many things, it's becoming very specialist. Well, are you going to stick with that specialty your whole career? Or are you going to view that as a foundation that you can move around from? And I think that's a really interesting challenge for a lot of people. I think a lot of people with incredible skills, incredible technical skills, get to the point where they say, well, I don't want to do this anymore. I'd like to do something else. And that's hard to do, but it's a very valuable insight to have.
Brilliant. And you have this theme in the book about building extended networks.
Yeah.
And I love that theme, and I love the way you speak about it. How do you suggest, it's really interesting because today we have things like LinkedIn, you have Facebook, you have all these social networking platforms. What do you feel has been the best way in your career, and what do you foresee as being the method for building good networks for people in the future generations?
So one of the things I talk about in the book is the concept of strong ties, weak ties, and dormant ties. And just to explain what those are, strong ties are the close friendships that we have at any stage in our life. But if we're honest, those strong ties are often quite narrow because they're in our job, they're in our immediate social network, they're often with people who are a lot like us. But sometimes we draw real insight from weak ties, which is people we know much less well, but we have some vague connection to. They might be just people we meet almost randomly. But the most important ties, particularly for people my age and generation, are what are called dormant ties, which is people we used to know, who we've lost touch with, who've gone down their own path and have something to teach us. Typically, those are things like old college friends, old high school friends, people you haven't seen sometimes for 10 or 20 years that you somehow reconnect with, and you learn so much from their life, and oftentimes they can help you.
Okay, brilliant. And how do you see that? Which have been the people in your network that helped you the most? Or when you look back and think, okay, that person, and that person.
Well, that's why it's so resonant to me, because in the last few years, as I thought about what I wanted to do, I found myself tapping into each of those, but particularly the dormant ties. And it was the dormant ties, the people with whom my relationship had lain dormant for a number of years. I hadn't seen them, we'd fallen out of touch, we got disconnected. I was able to reach out to them, or they to me, and they helped me, in my case, change direction in my career. And they actually helped me with this book, which was something I could never have predicted.
And what are your practical tips on networking? Because I know that, so I went to a conference recently that I was speaking at, and it was really strange because literally everyone walked over to each other's tables and handed all their cards out to every single person. And now if you're like some of the people I talk to, I know a lot of us barely can remember the name of the person we've just been introduced to. Yeah. So what are your tips on effective networking for the long term, as opposed to what we see as networking today, where you have people just handing their cards out? Or
yes, it's an interesting balance, isn't it? I do think young people today naturally want to network. I mean, all the technology enables them to do that, but it can become a little meaningless if it's just names on a piece, and if people aren't following it through. I think you have to be a little bit conscious and strategic about. You have to be purposeful about networking. It is a valuable thing to do. It's a valid part of life. It's not. It's not something to look down on. Oh, you know, so and so is just networking. I think it is an important thing to do. But you need to be strategic about it. You need to think, well, who are the people I really want to build relationships with, maintain relationships with, that I can help and who can help me? One of the most valuable books that I read in preparation for my own book was by Adam Grant. It's a book called Give and Take. And Adam's concept is that some of the most successful people are natural givers. And their approach to networking is not what can I get from my network? It's what can I give to my network? And I think that's a really important concept.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think the amount of times you receive emails where someone's offering to actually support something you're doing, you're much more likely to respond.
It's rare. We don't get enough of those. And when it happens, you're so pleased when somebody says, how can I help you? And actually they mean it. And when they introduce, and what has helped? Sometimes it can be nothing more than a one-line email from one friend to another saying, I got one just before I came here. Got an email from somebody who I've known for a long time who was connecting me with a friend of his and said, I think you guys should get together because I think you've got some interesting things to talk about together. And I was thrilled. I mean, I immediately responded, said, absolutely, let's do that. Absolutely. That's networking.
How do we differentiate between intuition with the right thing or to try and make money? Like, how do you know? Have you seen intuition play any role in your career, I guess, is the question that's coming across.
Absolutely. Intuition meaning you have an instinctive feeling that something is the right thing to do or the wrong thing to do. And I think most of us, that's the most powerful and the most important sensation to have. But it's not utterly reliable. Sometimes your intuition, I think one always has to be wary about intuition, is that there's another word beginning with in that's sort of closely associated with it, which is inertia. And intuition can sometimes just mean, you know what, I think I'm fine. I think I'll just carry on.
Yeah.
Inertia. What you want is to marry that sort of inherent desire for the security of the known with a more of a sort of look for, well, what else could I do? What's different? What could I test myself for? The issue about money is really important. I try to take this on honestly in the book. You know, the reality is many of our professional choices today are driven by financial considerations, whether it be paying off student debt or building a family life or sustaining a lifestyle. And you can start out thinking, well, I'll just do this for the money, but later on I'll do what I really want to do, and find that 30 years later you're still doing it for the money, because of course you get used to it. Understandable, let's just be conscious of it and understand that is a risk that you need to be aware of.
And what would be your recommendation to someone who has started on that path, halfway through, and now realizing that the money's not satisfying them completely, but like you said, they've got used to it.
Yeah.
And now when they're looking at the other options, naturally the other options financially don't look as lucrative.
Yeah.
And so they're, you know, what's your best advice for people in that situation?
Look, all I can say is you may need to take some risks, if you like, in order to find whether you can live a happy life with less money. Yes. I mean, obviously, if you go into government or you go into a non-profit or you go into a social purpose organization, that's going to be less money, most likely. You can think of that as an experiment. I'll do it for a couple of years and see. And then figure out, okay, this is really what I want. Now I have to recalibrate my life. And by the way, it may not be just your life. It may be the life of your spouse and children, and you know. But you can't ignore that question. You can't say, well, I'm not going to worry about that. That is something to worry about and to think about very consciously.
Totally. And we've got a good question coming here from Vani. She says, sometimes we have our own dreams, but our families want us to be somebody else. A lot of people have this dilemma, and sometimes we feel that we're disappointing them by being what we want to be. Choosing a career becomes difficult in this situation. Any advice?
Well, I think it's a very good question, and I think it illustrates the fact that oftentimes this is not about just one person. It is about, in my case, 6 people. I have a wife and 4 children, and I've had to make my decisions in part on the basis of what's right for all of us, not just on the basis. But there are moments, of course, when you say, okay, this is right for me, and I'm going to see if the family, if the people who I love will come with me. I moved to the US 10 years ago for my job. I mean, it was a professional opportunity for me. I don't think my family was necessarily at the time thinking, well, let's move to the US. But they came, and it's been a great experience for them and for all of us. And it was one of those things that just, it worked out for us all. But I think it's really important to understand that this is often a sort of collective process of thought rather than just an individual thought.
So guys, I'm now going to transition with Nick into our on-the-spot round. So if you're excited to see how well Nick does, I'm sure he'll do great. He's been working with clients for his whole life and has been answering tough questions. So I've got a few questions for you that I'd like you to answer as honestly, openly, and quickly as possible for our on-the-spot round. So Nick, I want you to answer in one word. My favorite way to unwind is?
Run.
Run. Oh wow, wasn't expecting that one. Oh, brilliant. And why running?
I've been running for my whole life, roughly 40 miles a week. And not 40 hours, although nowadays actually a mile takes roughly an hour. And I just find it the one thing I can do where my mind wanders.
Amazing.
And I find I write speeches. Well, I wrote a good part of this book in my mind running.
Unbelievable. Inside, outside?
Outside whenever it's not freezing.
Yes. Unbelievable. Okay, brilliant. Next question. The best advice you've ever received?
Leave.
From?
From the firm, from McKinsey. So it was try something else.
Okay.
And it came obviously at a fairly advanced stage, but it was, you've got to do something else.
And who gave you that advice?
My mentor.
Mentors, yeah. Very honest mentor.
Yep.
Amazing. Okay, brilliant. The worst.
I think he just wanted me to leave, but I took it as advice.
Yeah. What's the worst advice you've ever received?
Gosh. I mean, I'm bound to say stay in a way, but I mean, I think probably the worst advice was stick with what you're doing, don't look outside.
Okay, brilliant. The best advice you've ever given anyone?
I think the advice I've given in the book is make your passion your job, and as much as you possibly can, and whenever you possibly can.
Absolutely. And the worst advice you've ever given someone?
Maybe it is stay when they probably shouldn't have done.
And
honestly, that's a reflection of the tension you feel when you've had the kinds of jobs I've had, where when somebody says, I want to leave, your first instinct is, I've got to persuade them not to.
Yes.
But sometimes it's best if they do.
And how do we get leaders to, you've been in a leadership position, recruiting, nurturing talent. How do we get leaders to think more consciously and mindfully and actually think, wow, well, this person's potential may actually be better used somewhere else? How do you get leaders to have that switch? I
think it's a real challenge because so many of the pressures on leaders are to just carry on and keep people and to think quite narrowly both about their own lives and about the organizations they're leading. And I think we just need, with books like this and with that of others, is just try to open up the conversation, try to open up the debate. One of the things I'm very concerned about is who's in the government. I think that's a big issue. It's a big issue right now. I think we need people in the government who've had a broad variety of experiences. If we just have people in the government who've done one thing, we'll get one thing as a result. I don't think we've been having a great run on this recently. And I'd like to see a more imaginative approach to who's in the government. I hope maybe after next week we might get that. That requires people to think consciously about what kinds of experiences to have and how to bring them into government.
Definitely. Well, that was the next question on the list. What advice do you have for Donald Trump?
I don't have any advice for Donald Trump. I have nothing to say to Donald Trump.
And what advice?
But I think the next president does have a challenge. I think to some degree we do take our signal from the top. And I think this President Obama, has tried very hard to introduce new talents into government from business and especially from the non-profit arena. I think he's been the first technology president, and that has enabled him to bring in some of the skills and attitudes that we associate with Silicon Valley and with the tech community more broadly into government. I want to see much more of that in the next administration. I want it to be the technology plus, but not just technology as in the tools and the software and so on, but the mindset. That's what we want in government.
What kind of mindset? Give me that. I've got some ideas of what you're talking about.
Innovative, entrepreneurial, energetic, try things, accept failure, but then try again. And also literally applying technology more effectively to connect people and to deliver high quality services.
Absolutely. Do you have any advice for Hillary then? Or is the same advice?
It's the same advice. Really? I mean, I'm assuming, I'm hoping she is going to be the president, so it'll be advice to her. And I think she has been part of this period of really understanding what, at the State Department and elsewhere, understanding what modern technology and mindset can do for government, but there's a long way to go. And in fact, one of the reasons I wanted to write this book was because in the time I spent in government, I worked for the British Prime Minister, and then I worked as a consultant to the American government. I found this pretty rare, and I found it quite hard to see how the best modern approaches could be brought into government.
Mm-hmm. But do you feel hopeful? Do you feel that there are movements being made?
Oh, I do. Yeah, and I do think I feel hopeful because there's a lot of upside,
yes.
And also because I think the power of modern technology and the mindset that goes with it is so extraordinary that it's going to be transformative.
Brilliant. I apologize to you that I'm not making this very quick fire or on the spot. It's just
Sorry,
that there's so
fault.
many interesting... No, it's my fault. I keep diving into the answers, so it's totally my fault. So next question. What's the one thing you'd want to learn right now? Is there anything that you still want to learn, or the one thing if you could?
Chess. I know. You mean one thing about life?
Or anything. No, it could be a particular skill, a language.
The application of technology is fascinating to me now from my generation's perspective. I'm not a digital native. My kids are. So I'm at a fascinating stage where I am learning as much from my kids and from people my kids' age as I am from my own generation. That's wonderful.
Mm-hmm. What's the one thing you can't live without?
Running.
Nice. Running seems to be
it's the peace of mind, if you like, that comes. I know this because I got a couple of injuries in the last couple of years and had to stop, and it messed me up.
Oh no. Okay. Well, we hope you're better.
And I was. It's not a thing. I can't live without my wife, but that's a separate. I have to say that because she's watching.
Of course. Brilliant.
And I mean
Hello.
it.
Awesome. What's the book you've reread the most times?
So the book I have reread the most times is a biography of Lyndon Johnson by Robert Caro, which I think is an extraordinary book of history, and I'm a history buff, and I did history at university and so on. Mm-hmm. The book that's most relevant to this, I've already mentioned, Give and Take. That transformed my life because it made me realize that what I hoped was an innate desire to give and to help people was actually also a way of being successful, and that helped me a lot.
The educational system needs to change, says Cheryl, with teaching more usable and vocational interests, because college isn't the end all for everyone. What are your thoughts?
Well, I'm very glad at that comment. I completely agree with it. And in the book, I write about the real challenges facing what's called liberal education or liberal arts education, which is really under pressure. And there is this sort of belief that seems to have taken hold in the academic world that we need to train people for jobs rather than for life. And I really struggle with that. As I said, I was a history student. I like people who have that kind of liberal arts background. It's not very fashionable at the moment. Less than 7% of people in American universities have humanities majors. But even if I go even to the issue of a major, as we were talking about earlier, the first question you often ask of a college student is, well, what's your major? What's going to be your major? I think implicit in that question is, what are you going to do for the rest of your life? And I think it's a really dangerous thing. I think we need to take a much more liberal approach to education. I hope there is actually going to be a bit of a backlash, because I think we went way too far down this specialization route in education and in life.
And how much do you think education actually needs to be more about bringing out rather than putting into the individual? Because I always have that feeling when I lived as a monk, there was a big focus on almost pulling out the essence, the potential, the unique abilities of an individual that they already had inherently, as opposed to be putting more stuff in them and confusing them. I mean, have you heard, read, written about any of that?
Well, I'm very interested in your experience, because I hope that there'll be more sense of that in the university system. It's a wonderful opportunity to bring out what's inherent in people rather than just telling them what they need to know. I think honestly modern educators know that. I think actually the trend in education has been to be more participative, more engaging, more bringing people out of themselves, rather than just telling them what they need to know. But let's be honest, there's a real tension here, and I think we need to acknowledge that.
Completely, and I love what you said about training people for careers instead of training them for life. When you talk about in your book, go ahead.
Well, I think that we need to train people for life, of which their careers are going to be part.
Completely.
And we need to give them the the tools that are going to enable them to live a broader life.
Truly. And when you say prepared mind in your book, you talk about that being as one of the dimensions.
Yeah.
That sounds very much like life school training. Tell us more about how one can create a prepared mind.
I mean, there's this great quote from Louis Pasteur, the famous biochemist, that in the field of human observation, chance favors a prepared mind. And what that means is that you have to be conscious about, broadly speaking, what you're looking for, but have a wide canvas to look across and be ready for the unexpected discovery, for serendipity, for something to come your way that you weren't expecting and that you can respond to. Some of these are very tangible things, like being prepared financially. You know, we talked earlier about money, and the reality is a lot of people don't prepare themselves financially to take the kinds of choices that they want to take. But some of it is also mindfulness. It's being aware of yourself. It's this whole issue of self-assessment. Do I understand who I am and what really motivates me and how that's changed over time?
Totally. I've got a few more questions coming here. What advice would you give to your younger self?
I think the advice I would give is maintain a broad range of interests rather than be as completely focused as I was in the early stages of my career. I was a pretty narrow person at that stage. When I was at college, I was very broad-minded, and then I got a job, and I thought I've got to excel in this, and I just focused on it, and I think I lost something in the process, and it took me a while to get it back.
Unbelievable! It's so refreshing to hear that vulnerability and openness.
Well, I think it's a long time for me to remember what I was like in my 20s and 30s, but I think I became a rather narrow person, and I have found later on that things opened up for me, and that's been a remarkable experience.
Nice. Well, we wouldn't have you any other way. we're happy that you're writing about this now. Cheryl says, Nick, who is your superhero? It can be a person. It doesn't, someone that inspires you, someone that motivates you.
Well, I'm politically oriented. I'm inspired by Barack Obama. I have been inspired by him, and the very fact of him being president has been inspirational to me. But I'm also inspired by people like Adam Grant, who I think are changing our consciousness from a very different kind of platform, from an academic and a research platform, and really making us think in a different way about our lives. In another, somebody else, Susan Cain, who wrote the book Quiet, about how introverts can be incredibly successful. Those kinds of people, they're not necessarily natural heroic figures, but I find them heroic.
Yeah, definitely. I think they're bringing to the fore the conversations we need to be having right now. And that's definitely a heroic thing to do, even if it may not seem that way. Yeah. Guys, it's been great having this conversation. I hope that you're still tuned in with us. Remember, you can order the book. We've put it into the comments section, the Mosaic Principle that we've been talking about with Nick today. Any insights that you've liked, all of the concepts we've been speaking about are in this book. So feel free to click and order that as well. Nick, it's been a pleasure having you here. And I want to give you a moment to just say anything that you feel we haven't covered, anything that's on your mind. I know you're not running right now, but maybe there's an insight that's there that you've been thinking about that you feel the viewers would really benefit from.
Well, I think the questions and the comments have really reflected the tension that many of us feel between a desire to be professionally successful and personally fulfilled. And oftentimes in the modern world, the desire for professional success seems like it depends upon a high degree of focus and narrowness and specialization, whereas to be personally fulfilled, we need a wide range of interests and a wide range of pursuits. And I think being conscious of that tension is a first step, and then being able to take a step back from time to time and saying, okay, do I have the option of making an adjustment here, whether it be in my career or in the things I do outside of my life, that I can make now and adjust. And there's one final thing I'd say. The enemy of this is often seen to be time. Do I have enough time? Do I have enough time in a day, in a year, in a life? And I would say to that question, the answer is yes, you do have time. You had less time than you might like, but more time than you think. And that's, I think, a really important concept. There's time to do these things.
What a great note to end on. Absolutely brilliant. Find that time. Use your priorities wisely. We're all using our time in one way or the other. Thank you so much, Nick. Absolutely pleasure having you here. Really love talking to you today, and I think that this is such a relevant book for what young people today are going through. Thank you again, Nick, and I look forward to seeing you all tomorrow. Take care and see you soon. See you later.